Hi, Sri, and everyone else over there in India. Greetings again from traditional Catholic in Nova Scotia. So today I'm going to make a very brief video, more or less off the cuff of what I know about uh, a rather unique theological question that I've known has come up in India. Uh, the issue of caste. Now, such as the caste system and how, as a Christian, you should react to it. It's a kind of unique problem that India has how to deal with it. Not as much as you might think, though. But anyway, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how, as a traditional Catholic Christian, you should view the subject. So anyway, and I'm also going to give you a bit of history on how the spiritual successors of this guy, the Apostle Thomas, come into play, and what they got right and what they kind of got wrong, and why I probably think they got on the wrong path on that. So anyway, um, based on to base as a basic summation as to where I'm going this so that um you know as a basic summation, caste law is superstition and is a pagan superstition, and you as traditional Catholics should not pay any attention to it whatsoever and should just ignore it. It's silly and superstitious to think that uh if I understand the Hindu belief that there are certain people born in certain classes, um and therefore they may only do certain things, and that marriage is absolutely against God's will, that you should intermarry between them, is from a Christian perspective silly and foolish superstition. I have heard of the few instances of traditional Catholic priests in the modern day who have discussed it. That is what they have pretty well said, and I am well aware that there's even been papal condemnations of the practice among Christians. Now, the only exemption to now the most of all the practices that I have heard about the caste system, that it should be most particularly repugnant and despised by Catholics, is the treatment of the Dalits or untouchables. I remember hearing one of the articles. Again, it's a Wikipedia article. I'm just looking up bits of information that I know on this. But from what I've gathered, when the Pope of the time, I think it was Clement VII, heard about how how the Dalits were being treated, even among Christians, he was absolutely horrified and disgusted. Um, he said the only case he would permit a priest or any other Catholic to observe that particular taboo would be is if they are a missionary trying to convert a high caste Hindu, and the only way that the high caste Hindu will speak with them is if they've observed uh, the rule of untouchability and have not gone near Dalits. That's the only case. Otherwise, that it is expressly forbidden to observe it in any way. Um, now, now it took a while to basically reach this conclusion by the church, largely because when the Catholic missionaries first came to India under Saint Francis Xavier, they really didn't get a whole get understand the full nature of the caste system, and they thought it was just similar to class systems in Europe. Also, they wanted to respect Indian culture. So a bit of history of how here's a bit of a history of how and why these conclusions haven't made and reached, and was and was not allowed in the past and why. So anyway, so anyway, centuries and centuries and centuries ago, before Francis Xavier, we get the first Christian missionary to India, the Apostle Thomas. I remember reading his Acts a few years ago of his missionary work in India. Uh, it was quite interesting. He apparently at first did not wish to go to India, and he refused to go. So eventually, a man came to him one day and asked him if he was the slave of Jesus Christ, of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Uh, St. Thomas, of course, being a good Christian apostle, said, "Yes, I am, of course." In which case, the man said, "I'm a slave trader. Your master says you are to go with me to India." And so he was put on a slave ship and was brought to India and was sold as a slave to a Hindu king. I recall reading the text of the story. The king told him to build a palace because he was apparently a carpenter. and King Sempim sending him money, but the king would send the but St. Thomas would give the gold to the poor, and when the king was asking for updates on how his palace was coming, he would say, "Oh, this porch is ready. Oh, this is ready. Oh, that's ready." So the king eventually the king came back and asked where his palace was. St. Thomas told him he was in heaven. So, the king was not amused and sent and imprisoned him. However, really around the same time the king's brother died, then suddenly came back to life. The king's brother then went uh, came to the king and told him this: "Oh, my brother, sell me your palace which is in heaven. I have seen it. It is magnificent. I will give you everything I have for it." At that point, the king realized who Thomas was, and was baptized, became one of the first Christians of India. And if I recall correctly, he was ordained either a priest or a bishop, and his brother was ordained a deacon, if I recall according to the account. If I'm recalling correctly. Anyway, later on, Thomas went to further down towards the Malabar coast, and he saw some Brahmins doing their morning pujas, offering water to the gods. So he asked them, "What are you doing?" The Brahmins told him, "We are offering water to our gods." St. Thomas said, "Your gods must not like your offering very much, because the water keeps them falling back down. They must be clearly rejecting the offering." So the Apostle Thomas took some water, offered it to Jesus Christ. He threw the water up in the air. The water went up, 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 and up. We are still waiting for that water to come back down. Um, and they were all the Brahmins were baptized on the spot. Now, is there anything you noticed about the people who St. Thomas is converting so far? They're all basically high caste Hindus, Brahmins, and the Kshatriya. I'm the warrior caste. I'm probably mispronouncing. Please forgive me. Uh, but basically, they were all largely high caste Hindus. St. Thomas Christians, the people from all across castes, but the majority of them are high caste, from what I understand. So, one of my personal opinions is that they wanted to keep their high caste status. So they've to this day, unfortunately, though I have to admit, there are efforts now among some of them to at least try to break down these old taboos. They would have observed caste law. And unfortunately, over the centuries, the St. Thomas Christians have fallen into other heresies, notably Monophysitism and Nostarianism. Um, Monophysitism is and Nostarianism are both what we call Christological heresies. They're basically errors on Jesus is God and man. How exactly does that work? Those are basically heretical opinions on how it works. I'll just explain Nostarianism. Nostarianism is basically the belief that Jesus' human nature was like a coat, and his divine nature is like his body, and God was just wearing human body or human nature. It wasn't actually part of him. Um, And as a result, Nostarians would say that Mary is not the mother of God. But if that's the case in the book of Acts, how did they crucify the author of life, as it says in the book of Acts? So that's one obvious reason why that's a theological problem. And also, if only who died on the cross, God or man? And if only man died on the cross, if only what body was crossed, then how does that atone for the sins of the whole world? Um, so that's a so Nostarianism is a heresy. And it's one of the heresies that the St. Thomas Christians over the centuries unfortunately fell into because of influence from the Assyrian Church of the East in Iraq, which became Nostarian when the heresy began. But anyway, back to the question of caste. Now, over in Europe, meanwhile, Europe was being converted and Christianized as well. They also had a bit of a class system as well. Now, it wasn't quite the same. It wasn't was not quite the same. Um, now, even though there were no there was a notion of people. There were certain cultures in Europe, Christian cultures in Europe, where classes did not intermingle, and if they did, uh, they did not. They did not. They did care about succession laws, and they had and things like that, especially among nobility and royalty. So in France, in particular, they had a custom known as morganatic marriage. So basically, in one case, I believe it was Louis XIV, King of France. He married a woman who was a not royalty. I think she was no, wasn't even nobility, just a commoner or low-level nobility. But as a result, he married her morganatically, meaning any children they had would not be in any of their descendants would not be in line to inherit the throne of France. Is basically what that meant. Now, and similarly, there was definitely a class system in Europe. There was nobility, there was a peasantry who worked, basically kind of like basically the equivalent of Shudra. There were a warrior caste, and there wasn't really a priestly caste, as traditional Catholic priests in the Western tradition are by nature celibate, do not marry, do not have children, and so like the nobility would, and so the high-ranking clergy would often be from nobility and more lower, in would and et cetera, and so forth. And you would sometimes get the lower-ranking peasants becoming clergymen as well. You would draw from both ranks, and they're both ranks. But as you can see, there's certain things about that this is very different from what you have in India. So, for example, one big difference: no one really believed that it was divine law that you could not marry in that the class system was divine law as such. People certain think that God may cause certain families to rule. Certainly, um, that was certainly a prominent opinion. Um, there was certainly believed that it was certainly believed that God respected and had high regard for these family traditions, which is a valid opinion to hold as well. But at the same time, there were emperors of the Byzantine Empire who were originally, I think, who were originally pig farmers, for example. There are current the former royal houses in Europe, particularly notably Serbia, whose ancestors were literally outlaws and bandits, and rose to the ranks. There were popes who were nobility. There were popes who were from merchant families. There were popes who were peasants. I think there's even one claimant to the papal throne when there was a dispute over which pope who was even had a cousin who had whose brother or cousin was a pirate. So it wasn't as strict. It was a cultural custom that they believed that they should respect, and that God wanted them to respect. But then there, but that was it. And there was definitely intermarriage between the groups, and and it was not totally static. Knights originally were not nobility, and then they were recognized as nobility later on, and they would and the women and they would also and the lower class men would often try to marry high class women. So there was so unlike in the caste system in India, there was definitely a great deal amount of intermarriage. I think at this point I've heard it said that just about everyone in England right now is a descendant in some way of the first Norman king of England, William the Conqueror, over the years because of intermarriage over 1,000 years. And everyone and there have been cases. I remember taking history class was nobility. They had to really look into local parish register of a small parish farm because it turned out that there was a non-noble ancestor who was a simple peasant who was a who and they couldn't do a marriage between a couple because they were too closely related because their great grandfather was a common ancestor of both, and he had been a peasant, even though both the couples who were wanting to marry, who now couldn't, were comparatively high ranking nobility. So it wasn't it wasn't as strict a thing, and commoners were elevated to nobility and royalty, and there were royal etc. and so forth. But it was more of a cultural custom it was more accurate to call it a cultural custom God wanted them to respect. So when the Catholic missionaries first came to India, heard about the caste system, thought it was just like what they had in Europe, and one of the things they wanted to do because they've had not so good practice of this elsewhere is that they wanted to respect local traditions as far as they possibly could. So I know for a fact that in, say, Mexico, when they first came, This wasn't done very well, and it resulted in a lot of destruction of people's heritage and culture, of heritage and culture. And many of the priests complained about how some of the native populations were treated to the King of Spain, um, and insisted that they be allowed to be that their certain rights should that he did have that should be respected. Um, so this is basic. So this so when they came to India, they about the caste system. They don't want to make Indians European. They wanted to make them Christian. It's basically what they want to do. And I've even heard of some cases of just how far they went, particularly among the Jesuits, who are legendary for trying to take respect for local cultural customs to an extent where the popes had to reel them in sometimes, saying no, this is too far. Um, so, for example, they respected caste law. When Brahmins were baptized, they allowed them to practice, as they said at first. The Jesuits let them practice on untouchability and let them even keep their sashes and cords and their tufts of hair that Brahmins have, apparently. From what I've heard. And the sashes, the only exemption with the sash is that if they had received it in an idolatrous ceremony, they had to replace with a new one, which had to be blessed by a Catholic priest. Uh, and eventually, what was kind of like the final straw. Now, there were some customs that were done in India uniquely that were legitimate, that were all fortunately also suppressed. But that's another thing among the Christians there. But that was nothing later on. Now, as I said, the final straw for this was untouchability. When the Pope heard about this, now what was apparently was going on is that some priests were going. There are certain ceremonies when you bring the Blessed Sacrament to someone who's sick and dying. They would make a huge, small procession and ring bells, and go visit the person's house. They would apparently they was tried to respect local practice of caste law so far that when there was a higher caste, like a Varna Hindu caste, who would like a or like for example a Brahmin, he was dying. They would do that with a Brahmin, but if a Dalit was dying, they would either go secretly or in some cases not even go at all. When the Pope heard about this, he put his foot down, as he well should have. He said, "No, like the idea that you should treat people like this was simply not done, even among the different classes in Europe. Everyone, it was glory given to God, and God was for everyone, and so he absolutely forbade this practice to take place, this to be done anymore. They are to show equal respect to both sides." Uh, and he pointed out quite legitimately that the idea that certain classes of people are automatically unclean ritually, or had to by divine law do a certain thing is absurd. Is basically absurd, and it's frank, and it comes from from the pagan Hindu tradition. It is not something that should be viewed or respected as such among Christians. And so he forbade all these practices of like, for understand, he forbade like furthermore blessing Brahmins' clothes and stuff like that, and especially mistreatment of the Dalits, and that was to, and it has been condemned. It has been condemned ever since once the Pope realized exactly what was going on. So basically, feel free to ask me if you have any more questions on the matter. I'll try to answer, and I hope I've been clear as far as I can. But basically, caste caste law is like a Hindu tradition. It is a pagan one. It is not a Christian one. So anyway, I want to wish anyway. God bless you all and stay safe and love everyone. Love everyone near you. Tack